Hey, friends. This is Martine Williams, and I am obsessed with all things mompreneur life and helping you to remix your priorities, your habits, your mindsets, and yes, even your relationships so that you can build a successful business without losing yourself in the process. I'm also obsessed with the color turquoise and lyrics of the 80s and 90s, but that's beside the point. Girlfriend, you don't have to hustle 24/7, 365 and continue to sacrifice your health, your relationships, and your sanity to be a successful mompreneur. As a small town girl living in a lonely world to a six-figure mompreneur, I am here to teach you how. There is a better way, and this podcast is your one-stop shop for all of the how-tos, the encouragement, the life hacks, the success tips, and of course, a little side of tough love. This is the Mompreneur Life Remixed podcast. So let's do this. What's up, friends? Today's episode, I've been super excited to bring to you since I met today's guest. So a couple of months ago, our church had family teams come in and do a weekend with us, and it was amazing. You've heard me talk about it a little bit, but there was just no way that I could do my own kind of recap and description of all that we learned. And so I asked Jeremy Pryor to come on to the podcast. So he's our Turquoise Talk guest today and just share like his background, how he started family teams. What does a multi-generational team on mission look like? How do you build family businesses? So we definitely cover the mompreneur life. It's a little bit different topic than probably what you're used to here on the podcast, but it's equally important. And it was something that really encouraged me, inspired me, and for sure challenged me in my parenting life and in my business. And I wanted to bring him on. So let me tell you a little bit about Jeremy. So Jeremy met his wife, April, in Jerusalem in 1997 when they were both students. They've spent the last 20 years building Team Pryor together. They have 5 kids, Kelsey, Jackson, Sydney, Elisa, and Kyra. They live in a multi-generational house with Jeremy's parents and April's mom in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, which is just a few miles from Cincinnati, Ohio. They founded and led several businesses and nonprofits, including Epiphany, a video production agency, Just So, a quilt shop, FamilyTeams.com, which is training content for families, which is what we're talking about today, and 1,000 Houses, which is a network of Cincinnati disciple-making households. For fun, the Pryors study Hebrew. They take groups to Israel, would love to do that one day, and they enjoy deep conversation over great food and read Tolkien by firelight. Y'all, this episode is amazing. It's a little bit longer than my typical episodes, but it's just jam-packed full of information. So buckle up, sister. Buckle up, dude, if I have a dude listening today. And I actually encourage you to have your spouse, your significant other, and even your kiddos listen to this episode. So really, really good. And let's get to it. Welcome back, friends, to the Mompreneur Life Remixed podcast. I am so excited about today's episode, and I'm just going to go ahead and say this. It's probably going to end up being a 2-part episode. This was really spearheaded from our local church. Had my guest for today and his wife, Jeremy and April Pryor, come in to do a weekend, a family teams weekend. And I was just telling Jeremy, there was no way I was going to be able to really explain the experience and just the information that he and it is April, right? I'm saying that right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And their kiddos were there as well. And there was just no way I was going to be able to really share all the things that that weekend was about. And so I asked if he would come onto the podcast, and he said yes. So thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming on the show. It's really, really exciting.
Absolutely. So excited to be here with you.
So tell for the listeners that maybe are not familiar with you and family teams, like just a little bit of background on how this all got started.
Yeah, well, so I grew up in Seattle, and I think that as a sort of Christian like young man, I was 23, single. I was not excited to start a family. I mean, that's kind of where it started for me. The family had looked like an experiment that had gone badly in so many of the families in the culture that I lived in. I was a part of a Christian community that was healthy and had a lot of strong families, but man, we were working with mostly kids outside of that system, and just most of my friends, and there was so much brokenness that it wasn't something that I thought was really had captured my excitement. And I had done a semester abroad when I was 23 in Jerusalem, and just encountered a totally different way of thinking about family. And I didn't realize that you could decide what kind of a family that you were going to build. That there was only one kind of a family that I had ever been really exposed to, just sort of a paradigm of family or a philosophy of family. And I encountered in the Middle East a very different kind of family. And and so I started to wonder, as a Christian believer in Jesus, I just wanted to study, does the Bible actually have a weigh in on this question? Is there a description for the way that God originally designed family? And so the more I dove into that, the more I really found the kind of family I was encountering in the Middle East to be far closer to the one that I also saw in the Bible. And so I began just a process of like, how do you move from a kind of a modern Western idea of family to a this sort of biblical or classical idea of family? And that transition really changed my heart dramatically. I got excited about being a dad. I got excited about having kids and working with my family and building a multi-generational family. So that was the transition for me that really changed the way I thought and lived.
That's awesome. And can you describe, maybe for the listeners that have not been, to the Middle East and have not witnessed what you saw, like what was it that you saw? This was really, I remember this when you were here in the area talking about this, how impactful it was, the Daddy Brigade.
Yes. Yeah. That's what struck me first, was just the person that was most likely to be most passionate about family was the dad. So you just saw fathers and kids in ways I had never seen before. And yeah, it did kind of culminate one day when I was sitting on a bench and I just watched a group of dads pushing strollers with little kids in tow. And I'd never seen anything like that before. Dads who were, that excited to have kids and really wanted to build up their family in that way, and just identifying as a father and really excited about being a father. And this was true in some of the friends I was making with different Arab families as well. They if you sat down and talked to them, all they want to do is talk about their kids, they were just dads through and through. And so that's what started to cause me to wonder, like, what is it that they think of family? Like, why is that? Why does family seem like it's such a kind of a downer for so many men in the West in particular? And then you have the men in the Middle East who are so excited about family. So diving to the roots of that has been, a big passion of mine to try to understand the answer to that question.
And I do think, I see it. And you talked about the spirit of the babysitter versus the spirit of the coach. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was something I definitely wrote down in my notes for us to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think if you were to try to look around and find an example in our culture for what a father looked like or looks like in those cultures or in history, I think the closest example that I've found is the coach. So a coach is somebody who's expected to work with the whole team, that there is a sense in which they are working with the individual players and constantly thinking about their development, that they have a plan for where to go, that they have a clear mission that they are driving towards. There's a ton of respect given to the coach as an understanding for why they have that role. And, so many men in our culture really aspire to be coaches or look up to coaches. And so it really represents much closer, because in those cultures, you do have, their businesses are family businesses. They have been passed on generationally. You have to develop the different children in your family in order for you to thrive or even survive in some contexts. And so constantly coaching, constantly developing, constantly leading, and casting vision and giving feedback and showing that unconditional love, but also the high expectations. This kind of thing that really makes for great coaching is the way that fathers in those cultures tend to act towards their families, and it causes a high level of engagement between them and their children. But I think that probably what's far closer to the way that we oftentimes think about how to engage with a family is more like a babysitter. Like we don't really need to have a vision for the family, for our kids, that they're here to keep them safe, to keep them occupied, But there isn't that forward looking, that vision where we're training our children, where we're taking them, further as a team. So I think that breakdown where the family is essentially becoming almost this kind of almost like a recreation retreat from what we all do individually the rest of our day, which has become totally normal. And again, I think the thing that's really troubling to me is that a lot of us have never even seen another way. We're not even aware that there is another way to do family. I certainly also was just not aware that there were different kinds of families. And so this kind of coaching role, which I think is very like comfortable and native to so many men in particular, that they could actually inhabit that in their family. When they don't find that, they usually go out and find that somewhere else. Both
Right.
men and women, I think, are looking to build teams, be a part of teams, serve teams, coach teams, lead teams, experience the belonging, the camaraderie, and all of the rewards of just getting to see progress happen in and through teams. That's not something that we think of families doing or being. That's what we think of work or sports or hobbies, where we experience most of that.
And where do you think all this started? So, like you said, most of us, this is what we've known. This is kind of the idea of family that we've known, and that has kind of been pushed through culture, right? The ideas that culture is pushing at. So where did this kind of like shift happen from, being more of a family team to now everybody's about self, right? It's all it's individualized. How can we, and we're going to talk about, the nest in just a few minutes, but kind of give some people context, like where did this start? Where did we start making this shift from family to individual?
Yeah, so I think that a transition really happened. It really started with the way that we do work or make money. So even at the turn of the 20th century, from the 1900s to the 1800s to the 1900s, over 70% of Americans lived on farms, and so people lived highly integrated lives with their family. Their ability to work as a family, really, their survival often depended on that. Their ability to eat, their ability to thrive as a family, passing on assets from one generation to the other. Generational connections had massive impacts on people's well-being. And so we really created a very different kind of society post-industrial revolution, where we started moving more towards cities, working more in larger corporations. Children went from being an asset to the family to a liability, that they just constantly were draining from the family. Education moved outside the home. Almost all of these various activities moved outside of the home. And so the home became just sort of hollowed out. There was no real productive activity. So historically, you had people living in, something that we kind of call households. They would have people, 15, 20, 30 people. You had multi-generational families living together. You had people that were, employed by the family living together. At the heartbeat of most families was a economic enterprise of some kind that really put to work many of the family members. And so that whole trajectory changed. And then you had, in addition to kind of the economics and meaning being taken out of the home and placed in other institutions outside the household, but you also had what sociologists call the assumption of stability, which is that, if we don't work as a team, if my kids, we don't figure out ways to get along and work together, my survival is really not at stake. They'll be fine. No one's going to starve. And so when that happens, people tend to become more individualistic, and so it's one thing when you think, oh, we really need to work together. It's another thing to say it's a choice. And if it's a choice, we tend to move away from that. David Brooks said recently that when Americans become wealthy, they purchase loneliness. And there is this trajectory that we move towards hyper individualism. And we don't realize how many people are living and dying alone. And if they look back, if you see how many people are isolated, towards the last 10, 20, 30 years of their life with almost no meaning or purpose or deep relational connections with others. A lot of that, it really comes back to this transition that we've gone through. And nobody really wants to live and die that way. But I do think we make choices that lead in that direction predictably. And I think there were forces at work historically that we've overcome, and overcoming some of those forces, we've made some really unfortunate choices with what that has done to the family, and the decision to really promote individualism at every turn, individual freedom at every turn, at the expense of any kind of cohesive family kind of identity.
Right. Right. One of the questions you asked right when you started the session was how many of us could name like our great grandparents or a great. And I mean, I couldn't think back far enough, and you had people stand in the room if you could name like 5 or 6 generations. And it is just so like, it was just so eye opening, and also just wow. Like, how do we shift that? If someone's listening and they're like, that's me, and I have been focusing on, individual success. How do they get started? Like, what's something they can start focusing on?
Yeah. Well, it does start with the decision to think like, what is there really any relevance to those generational connections? For most people, there really isn't. The reason why that we can't name our great grandparents is because they're not relevant to our lives. We don't think they are, because we've adopted a philosophy of life that is hyper individual. And so you think back 80, 100 years, what do they have to do with me? Where historically people were extremely interested in the generational descendants. They understood the continuity and that their ability to look back and understand the contribution given to them by previous generations, and that what they were doing in this life was really, they were a small part of a large story, and that what they did was so strategic for the future. And so they lived a life of real service towards their children and grandchildren, great grandchildren, families that had generations that served the future and honored the past in that way, tended to thrive and as families, and those that didn't, they did not. Now today we care about that. We're like, we don't want people to suffer because of things that happened in the past. We don't want people to be advantaged because of things that are being done for them in the present. We want everyone to be on an equal playing field. But what we don't realize is that is really dangerous for the future, because it really, what it does is it tells people in the present, just care about yourself. Don't think about the future. Don't think about your children and your grandchildren. You're not going to have much of impact on them. They're going to be educated. They're going to get the benefits of, a society, and the government's going to take care of those kinds of things so that they make sure that they're equal. And so there's nothing you can really do but really pay attention to what you want. And this is an absolutely devastating message to give to a generation of parents who could otherwise sacrifice for the future and love their future children and grandchildren, but instead are going to think about themselves increasingly. And then so we have that where we don't really sense or understand that connection. So I think where it starts is you have to decide, what do you think is really true? What kind of world, what kind of reality do we live in? Do we live in a reality in which everyone is sort of an individual? They just sort of appear here and we're all kind of on an equal playing field. And or do we live in a society in which our families do have a massive impact on our quality of life, our ability to have purpose and meaning in our lives? We live in a relational society where those relational connections are at the root of what creates meaning, or are we living in a hyper individual society where I need to come up with enough hobbies and work related activities to sort of cuddle together some kind of individual meaning out of my life? And people are so depressed, so full of anxiety, so rootless, because we're not built to sort of invent our individual identity out of nothing. But that's what we're being told to do today. Yeah,
that's so true. It's so true. And I will tell you, it was a huge smack to my face when you talked about the difference in, raising the kids to fly away, fly the nest, and family is a springboard for individual success. That keeps playing over in my head because, as a mom and my husband Shaw, we have been tried to really raise our kids to be confident and to be independent, obviously with a strong faith. And while I know you're saying we should still be building independence, it's still not, let's build them up and send them out an empty nest. So can you, for someone who's never heard that before, because when I heard that, I thought my first reaction was, I've totally messed my kids up. I'm totally messing this thing up called parenthood. Because it just, once you explained it, it made so much sense. And so for someone who's listening, who may have that same mindset that I had, go ahead and give them that same dose of reality.
Well, yeah. So I think it's important to maybe classify what kind of family we tend to all believe in this country and in the West.
Okay.
And so I think the most simple way to describe that is a springboard for individual success. That's a successful family. And so if you're hanging out with your friends, and you're in your 40s and 50s and your kids are starting to really, succeed and fly, away and have their, you feel like we did our job, like we did our best. And this is what our job is to just make sure our kids are happy and that they're off and doing well in their individual independent lives. And that's the best you could hope for. And that's the whole point of, and so and when you think about that kind of a picture of family, it's, the best analogy is the nest, right? It's a perfect analogy for what we think of family is. It's like you create a nurturing environment for your children for a very temporary period of time. And just like when you watch birds fly out of the nest gets totally abandoned and nobody ever comes back, and it starts all over and it's forgotten. That's what we think of family really is. Now that, again, I didn't know there was such a thing as a different kind of family. And that's why families that think this way tend to have about a maximum of about 80, maybe 100-year memory at the most. That's why if you ask most people who believe this kind of family is the kind of family that they're pursuing, or that they're used to understanding, that they can't usually name their great grandparents because it's not relevant. So, but it's important to just take that snapshot and say that is a kind of family. That's a very recent idea. It's very historically unusual. And I don't think it fits well into the biblical picture or any major religious idea of family, but it's what we've all decided to collectively agree on. And it's almost all we know. So, and in order to really understand how unusual that idea is, you have to contrast it with the classical family. So in almost any other time in history, Roman times, Greek times, Jewish history, in the Middle East today, in Asia, in most periods of time, Indian families, Chinese families, historically Japanese family, like you can go all the way back, most American families and European families of 150 years or older, they all would have a different idea of family than the one I just described. And so the best way I've known to describe that classical is this multi-generational team on mission. So they did not think of the family like a nest. They thought of it like a team. You have lots of roles and responsibilities that are a part of your life, your whole life, and that you didn't just appear. And this isn't just a nest. Like, we're stewarding together. It's like the baton has been passed to a generation. And now my job is to really use this opportunity that I have in leading the family line. I inherit the family resources and assets and vision, and then we're going to push forward into the future for the sake of our children, our grandchildren. And then our ability to do that is really going to determine oftentimes their quality of life in the future. So that has been reality for most of human life. And I think it makes sense of why families are designed the way they're designed. I think the nest idea, it's very difficult. If I believe that, to be honest, I just would not. I would want to have fewer children. I really wouldn't want to. It's very difficult to sacrifice my life for something I know is going to self-destruct in 20 years. And so, I would get on with my individual life. But man, when I started thinking about the family as a multi-generational family, and there's that legacy, that continuity, that memory, and the impact that has, and it multiplies across generations, and that I am stewarding something that has been given to me, and that I need to honor what's been passed down to me. And I have a very short opportunity here to steward those things for the sake of the future. That excites me, and that I get to coach this team for this time. Now, the part of the problem, of course, is that everything in society, just about that we have with family, is designed around the nest idea.
Yeah.
So you become a very strange creature as a family, a strange. Like, when you try to do it differently, like, people are like, what are you doing? It doesn't even make sense. Like, I'm doing something that I'm leading and building the kind of family that we've been building for thousands of years. But I find the nest idea very unusual. And I think the important thing to point out is it isn't going well. Like, it'd be one thing if this nest idea emerged and it just created so much more flourishing, so much more relational continuity. I just saw a statistic just this week that said that in America there are more single parent families than in any other country in the entire world.
Wow.
That is crazy. So basically, as you get, the more hyper individualistic you get, the more the family breaks down into its components. into its individual. And it makes sense. Like if all that matters is really ultimately what I want as an individual, it's very, very hard to stay together for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years and sacrifice my individual needs for the group. Why would I ever do that? If you go to almost any counselor, they'll say, hey, don't do that. Like, what do you want? Who are you trying to be? That's a very unusual attitude when you're talking about family. And it's also, by the way, something that nobody would tolerate if they're coaching a team. Nobody would, you don't ever go to your coach and say, look, coach, I get what you're trying to do. You're trying to win the game. So I don't really care about that. Really, I care about my individual needs. Like, can you just pass me the ball and let me experience what I want? Because that's really, no, you would immediately like get benched by any coach. We understand the beauty of sacrifice when we're in a team environment. We don't think that we're living a team sport as a family. We think it's an individual sport, and it's been terribly destructive on the family.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask you to share some stats. I think I was listening to another podcast you were on. You were kind of sharing like how the outcomes are very different from, classical, versus Western. Am I saying that right? Yeah.
Yeah, modern Western families. Yeah,
modern Western. Yeah. Can you share some more stats just for those that are listening? Do you have some other stats that you can share about just the different outcomes that come from the two different ideas of family?
Yeah. So another aspect, I think, is that, like I've described, I think that the nest idea is particularly confusing and for men. And so we have now, 60% of children live some part of their childhood in modern Western culture outside of the home of their biological father. So we have, more than half of children, experiencing at least part of their childhood not with their father. Why do so many fathers abandon families?
Yeah.
I think that they don't, again, when it was so night and day when I was in the Middle East and just heard how passionate, how deeply fathers identified with their children. And a lot of it came from their multi-generational heritage. They were living in a multi-generational home. They were, they weren't as concerned about their individual life. They were thinking about their family. And I think that the whole culture reinforced that, and that their whole idea of family reinforced that. Another reality in terms of passing on our faith is that I think we're seeing now that the stats are getting to about 20% of evangelical children raised in evangelical families are adopting the faith of their parents. And if you look at cultures where family is really the center, like Orthodox Jews or Amish, it's much closer to 95%. And so that's if you really care a lot about your faith and passing on your faith, this idea of like, hey, let's not give you any roots. Let's all be hyper individualistic. Let's all find ourselves, and let's not kind of pass on all our faith or our family story into your identity. You just invent your own identity. It turns out when you do that, they lose their faith in massive, massive numbers, and it completely makes sense. And that that's a choice and then this is kind of what I think what we're trying to do at family teams is just kind of raise up the flag and say, hey guys, that's a choice. Like, there are different, it's a free country. You can raise whatever kind of family you want. Yeah. If you want to raise a nest, then just know that the statistics are really, really bad when it comes to how our faith tends to gets passed on to our children.
Yeah. Well, I love what you shared, because again, I know someone's listening and there are, especially as a mom, they're already starting to like beat themselves up, but it's grace, right? I mean, you want to give yourself grace as you're transitioning, now you have this awareness and maybe this new idea, or really fully understanding what the biblical family looks like. My Lucas is getting ready to be 18. So he is what I would have said in the past, getting ready to fly the nest. And I have a 15-year-old. So it almost felt like that day, I wanted to give myself grace, but I also felt like, have I missed it? Have I missed the opportunity to implement some of these things that I'm learning with family teams? So if someone's listening and that's where they are, what kind of encouragement can you give?
There are like seasons in the life of a multi-generational family where there's a lot of interest in working together as a team. So, so definitely, obviously, when you get married, when you start having children, when your kids are young and, you're educating them. And I do think that there is a time around the time of like 13, 14, all the way through probably early 20s, where there's a necessary differentiation that children go through. We become, more of a counselor in their life as opposed to like directly. And then I think the next phase is that they start having children. And when that happens, a whole nother opportunity tends to open up where you can pitch the idea and make clear to your kids, look, I want to be a really active grandparent. I really want to be a part of of my grandkids' lives. I want to support you and what your goals are. I want us to collectively talk about what those things could be. How can we, what are, let's understand what are the different missions that God's giving our family, giving your family, your branch of the family line. And so there's a lot of benefits that can come from intergenerational living if there's a lot of healthy relationships between generations. So that I would say that, to be supporting our kids in that season of differentiation, it's okay for there to be that season. That's different than the bird that flies the nest, and sort of there's never any kind of return to working together. I think that being a single that's the one time in your life where you really can experience a lot of things that you can't in other times. And so I think you taking on challenges as an individual, we certainly encourage that for our kids. But we're experiencing that now, kind of what you're describing. We've got my daughter Sydney. She's 19. She's living in Norway, and we just went out there to visit her. And she's on mission. She's heading to Thailand, and next week. And so we're constantly trying to think about how to help her. But my older daughter, Kelsey, who's 23, she went through, seasons where she was traveling a lot and experienced a lot of those things. But now she's pregnant, having a child. She lives 5 minutes away. She works, in my business. She works in, with her mom and her grandma. And so we have, a lot, we're preparing ourselves as a multi-generational family to support her and her husband as they begin to have children. And that's a really hard thing to endure, and thrive in very difficult survival seasons, especially if you want to have a larger family, which I know they do. And, and so I think that the more they pursue that, then the more it's going to make sense for us to work together. So it's definitely never, ever, ever too late. If you're breathing, there are so many opportunities to engage with your family and to ask these questions. I think another tool that if you're in a season where your kids are in that differentiation or, beginning to do that, is something like an annual summit, and say, if we're going to design once a year an opportunity for us to come together, and for a couple of days, we're going to, rent an Airbnb, or we're going to create a place where we can all share what do you feel like God's calling you to do? How can we support each other? Instead of having family reunions that just kind of remember the good old days and, experience the nostalgia, why not talk about advancing as a family? Right. What does it look like for us to help each other? Let's really understand each other. Let's tell the family stories. Let's give each other, deep roots, not to hold each other back, but really to further each other. The trees with the deepest roots grow the highest. Yeah. And so I think if your kids really sense that there's a lot of strength coming from there, I think that they will appreciate and honor the family that they come from. And then as they begin to start their own branch of the family, I think that the kind of interdependence that is really healthy in a multi-generational family starts to make a lot of sense. Yeah, that's good. Very good. I'm literally just hanging on every word you're saying, knowing the season that we're in with our kids right now. And I kind of want to return a little bit back to the dad or the father role and the identity. As a mompreneur coach for many years, I definitely see that absence of the leadership in the home from the dad, and from the husband. And I don't know, there's no easy fix to it, right? But I know there's a mompreneur who's listening right now, and she's wishing that identity and that role would come more strongly in her family. She's feeling like she needs to be the leader. She needs to, not only be the leader, but be the CEO of her company and all of those things. What kind of encouragement could you give to her to maybe either have the conversation around, hey, this is not the identity that God is giving me. Like, this is your role. That's a really hard conversation to have, but I just see it all the time, Jeremy. I know it's so common. Yeah. Well, I think diagnosing properly, we really imagine, you're telling men that that it's all about individualism, and that everyone needs to sort of fight for what they want and what's best for them, to look out for number one. And then imagine in a context like that, you then give power to just the man in the family to say, you now have a trump card over everything that happens. We're going to listen and submit to you, but their vision is individualism, their own individualism first. And like it makes sense why a lot of women have really militated against this idea, because if the husband's been trained that's the nature of family in reality, then she's putting herself in a really tough situation there. Now, I do believe that men should lead, and I think that fathers are given that, because I think we were designed to coach and lead families, and to sacrifice for our families. I think that when you're leading, the father should sacrifice first and sacrifice most. And it's really through that process of saying, like, I care the most about this. I'm going to think the hardest about this, and I'm going to sacrifice, repeatedly for what this vision is. And I'm going to call you to do the same with me as a team. That comes across very differently, right? So when you're on a team and a coach is the first one to show up and the last one to leave, and is showing the most passion and is getting involved and helping and constantly thinking and strategizing and loving the different teammates, then it's very natural for the team to rally around the coach and to enjoy his leadership. But imagine if the coach is the last one to show up and the first one to leave, right. Basically takes all the glory for himself, and then, enjoys all those things. Like, again, I think we have to understand that the problem is much deeper than we understand. Like, men don't know who they are. We don't know what a father is.
Yeah.
And so we've deeply confused that role. And so unless this man really starts to understand who he is, then it's likely that he will either neglect or maybe even abuse the role that he's been given as a purely a privilege as opposed to a responsibility.
That's good. Because I know I've heard so many say, yeah, he thinks he's babysitting, that's how he sees it. And I think the idea when you were talking about, how many men jump to be the coach right on the field, they're so excited about the coaching. And if we can just help them to have that mindset shift and that belief change that, hey, I get to be the coach. It's not I have to be, I get to be. But they're just not seeing that role in that identity. And I think that was really, really huge. So I want, for the moms that are listening, the wives that are listening, hopefully you're going to listen to this episode also as a family. Hopefully that was helpful. And I think it was. So I know that you also, you do life and work together. And I want to kind of, since I do have mompreneurs that are listening, and maybe they do want, they caught the idea of the multi-generational team on mission, and they want to try to incorporate more work life with their family. Can you tell us a little bit about, I know you said there's 3 different business types, family businesses. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of describe that for those that are listening?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I'm very captured by the idea of integration. Like, what does it look like? Because there is, I really see that there are kind of a couple different paradigms. There's work-life balance, which I think makes a lot of sense when you're an employee. Like,
right.
If I'm on this employer's time clock, I'm forced to give them 100% of my attention, 100% of my focus. And so I need to really build a barrier between when I'm on call and when I'm able to really be with my kids, be with my family, and I can think about my own things. I think that we have to be really careful not to bring that employee mentality into business ownership, because in business ownership, what if I want to be 95%, focused on work and integrate with my kids more? Right. So like an example for me is, and the way we did this as a family is we owned our own companies, and I was constantly doing these experiments and integration. Like, what if we try this? What if we tried? Some of the experiments failed miserably, and we're like, let's not try that again. Like that, that was way too distracting. I don't want my kids running into a Zoom call, whatever it is. And there are other experiments that worked incredibly well. And we were recapturing, 4, 5, 10 hours a week of time with our kids, which is just mind blowing if you think about the lifespan of their childhood in our home, And so like one of the experiments for us was I took a kid to work with me, every day of the week. I had 5 kids. So there's a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And we had to design things very specifically. I was CEO for 4 years. I mean, I had some really demanding jobs, but we were owning the companies. And so I had the ability to make the experiment or the integration kind of work with the business. And so I would think about, okay, I'm going to do 50-minute meetings instead of 60-minute meetings. I'll take that 10 minutes. I'll spend time with my kids. How are you doing? What's going on? Bring them into meetings, debrief with them, be in the car with them, in between things, like talking to them, over lunch, having special lunch places, getting all that time with my kids. It was a huge blessing. And I'm constantly thinking about ways to integrate with my kids now. So I'm a huge believer in really thinking through that integration. So yeah, I spend a lot of time coaching families that are in this transition, and a lot of times they have a job and they have multiple kids, and so as I've done this over the last 15 years, I've noticed, to my surprise, that virtually everybody that I coach has not started one but three businesses.
Right.
And I've watched them do this over and over again. I'm like, wait, this is a pattern. And I did it on accident, and they kept doing it by accident. And I was like, okay, now I started to really understand why everyone was doing it. And this was a surprise to me. And had I known I was doing this, I think I would have done a lot better. And I can describe some mistakes I made, but it's the first business that people tend to start, especially if they're transitioning from employment, is what I like to call a freedom business, which just means that they're getting freedom from their employee and their employment situation. And usually the fastest, best way to quickly get that freedom that is a lower risk is to create a service-based business as opposed to a scale business. So a service-based business is often still tied to your time. It's a service you can provide to others, but it allows you to get a predictable return on your time, so that you can get out of that employment situation. Also allows you to really learn a lot of business basics, get used to working for yourself, and understand what that feels like. There's a lot of lessons you got to learn when you're moving from an employee to an employee and to a self-employed person. And then what tended to happen after they got control of their time was they would start a second business, a scale business. This was a business that wasn't tied to their time, but was tied to the product itself. And it allowed the business to scale in a way that wasn't, in sync with their time. So they're selling a product or productizing a service in such a way that they are able are bringing on employees, so that as they scale this business, these are more traditional businesses. Some of them might require investment or partnership, but by that time you can always fall back on your freedom business. You're often still operating in that mode, and your scale business may be sort of a second initiative that you're working on, but they tend to be higher risk, higher return kinds of businesses. And then the third business is a legacy business, and this is the capital intensive assets that your freedom and scale business, that as they become more and more profitable, instead of just like increasing your lifestyle, no, please begin to siphon that money into assets that are going to also produce income for your family. So that's the goal, is to build up enough assets in your legacy business to really secure your legacy, so that as you're getting older, as your grandchildren are coming, you now have the ability to spend time with them. You can control your time. You can work together as a family. It's not to necessarily stop working, but it's to control the kind of work, the who of work, so that you can be together and experience sort of maximum integration. And so we've seen a lot of families take this path, and it used to, for us, like I described it, I've had a lot of sort of false starts or steps back because I didn't really understand how all these were interconnected. And so it took me 15, 20 years to really get to a place where we had a decent legacy business going. But for a lot of families we're coaching now, it's taking 5-10 years, which is a tremendous accomplishment. There's no, getting rich quick, but man, that is amazing if you can get control of your time, before your grandkids start to come. Yeah. But the kind of family you can create, the kind of life you could create for that family is tremendous. It's just a really amazing thing to get to do. And so if it takes 10, 15, 20 years, I think it's definitely worth it as a pathway for family provision.
Well, you answered my question. I was going to say, how long do you think it would take if someone from start, from that freedom business to legacy? So that's really encouraging. And, I think be encouraged, the listeners, that there are people that are doing this and doing it well. It is a big shift from what you've been hearing and maybe some of the things that you've been doing. But I know you have a community and you have lots of resources that we'll definitely include in the show notes. What kind of boundaries need to be set when you think about, this whole integration with family in your business and you have your kids there? And can you talk a little bit about some healthy boundaries that maybe need to be set for those that are like, okay, yes, I'm in, I want to start building a freedom business. What does that actually look like with boundaries?
Yeah. A lot of it depends on your temperament. I mean, some people, I think that if your tendency is to focus on work, that's really when I think it's really important to think through what kind of boundaries are going to make sure you're not neglecting other roles in your life, other responsibilities that you have. And so what we really recommend is I'm a huge believer in rhythmic living and time blocking. I think that if you can design a 7-day rhythm and really understand what a Monday and a Tuesday and a Wednesday, including weekends, Saturday, Sunday, Like, what does it look like? What are those time blocks, those morning, afternoon, evening time blocks? And honoring what those are, and constantly working on that rhythm so that I know what my time is for. And so I kind of know what I'm focusing on. I kind of know who I am in that time. Like as a father, I know, like, Wednesday evening, I am all in, but Tuesday I do work until usually 10 PM at night. That's a day that I work flat out for 14 hours, and I like that rhythm. I learned that rhythm really worked well for me. And we also have a Sabbath that we just do no work for 24 hours. So there's a rhythm to life that you want to develop that really produces a great level work, but also allows you to live into all the different identities that you have. And so I think some integration during your work time can be really, really healthy. I think that depending on your kids' temperaments, depending on how well trained they are, depending on your temperament and your ability to handle and be productive in the midst of, some small distractions, all can play into what is really makes sense for you in each of those things. But yeah, I think that understanding what those blocks are for, and oftentimes, because we live in such a distracted age, we work all the time. We could, we have these screens with us constantly. And so I need to know what the vision is for this time. And if it doesn't have a vision, then I'm going to impulsively do whatever I feel like doing. And if that's just like consuming mindless entertainment or answering my emails, and so more than ever, we have to just be clear about what that vision is.
Yeah. And when you think, one of the questions I had was about your kids. Like, what were some of the things that they did in the businesses, even when they were little? Were there duties that you had for them? Or there like key activities that they were able to help with? Because I think someone's listening like, yeah, okay, well, I have a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old. Like, what could they possibly do in the business? So can you kind of share some real examples of how your family was integrated in the business part?
Yeah. Sometimes it took a lot of creativity, to figure out, and sometimes they were less helpful than others. But yeah, we had, I remember Sydney was 3 years old. We have a great picture of her, like putting stickers on our inventory. We had a eBay and Amazon business for a long time. And so, in, an e-commerce business. So they would help us with inventory. When my daughter Kelsey was 10 and my son Jackson was 8, they started a coffee shop at our actual workplace. And so they'd buy like muffins and bought an espresso machine. They'd go around the office just taking orders, and, they were experiencing that. And then my COO would like sit down with them and run through their P&L. And, they were like 8 and 10 years old, learning how to like what a business is and how to not lose money. And so they're just total natives. Well, one of the things that I believe in is a big deal is demystifying work for our children. And this is a huge gift of being an entrepreneur. There was a great Quora thread where somebody said, how do billionaires parent their children? And a billionaire actually got on there and he's like, I can tell you like what we do. We as early as possible demystify work. If your kid's just like, oh, dad just goes off to work, mom goes off to work, and then poof, money appears in our bank account. They don't understand how that works. Like today, like Kyra, my daughter, our youngest daughter, she's well known by the bank tellers in our town. She rides her bike and makes the deposits. She calculates all those things. She loves doing that. She loves doing customer service calls, and so we try things and we're like, okay, yeah, you're too young for that. Let's try this. Let's try that. And so, yeah, I'm like I said, I think the thing is that we have to be really open to experimenting and be honest about those experiments. But it's so worthwhile if you can find a way for your child to produce some value or to be integrated or to understand the work better as they're getting older, and you can start to figure out how that might work for you.
That's great. Lily said anything about Lucas and Nash, and, with one of my businesses, they would put the stickers on the catalogs and, just little things to kind of integrate. Yeah. And, my husband works away from home. He has his own brick and mortar business. And, the idea was, well, mom's working all day, but she's home. So she's also supposed to be my playmate. They didn't, I was working the same amount of hours as Shaw, but he was leaving. And so out of sight, out of mind, and like, well, dad's the one really working. Mom's home. She's supposed to kind of be the playmate. And, I had to set some good boundaries, but also try to include them. I've always tried to include them, and it's a family business. Both of our businesses, we've always seen it that way. But, I know someone's listening and are like, okay, how can I practically start including my family, into businesses, even if they're still working a full-time job and they're trying to build this freedom business, right? Or if their kids are still in school, they're not homeschooling them. What are some ways just to kind of get started with this? The transition, because it's not necessarily a quick and easy transition if you're trying to leave corporate into this, this new kind of mindset.
Yeah. I think it's fun to just, if there is something small, like a side hustle or something that you could do as
Mm-hmm.
a family that where you could start to practice this and just feel what it's like to try to do productive activity. When
Mm-hmm.
COVID hit, my first instinct was, I had literally six teenagers at home and we were all, and I was like, okay, guys, we're starting a business, and so we grew microgreens. We went to the farmer's market. We did deliveries to people's houses because nobody wanted to go out. And we were like, we will be a productive family. We will find ways to add value. And I think one of my kind of mantras increasingly for our family is we add value. Like we will produce things of value out of this household.
Mm. Yeah.
And so, it's not okay. What's happening so much today is people are looking around for a job and like, this is annoying, or this wage is not enough. And so they understandably are frustrated with the job market. And then they use that as an excuse to produce no value.
Right.
And I think this is happening to young people today because it is a tough economy for a lot of them. They aren't able to make as much as their parents made in employment situations, and so there is this opting out, sort of quiet quitting kind of culture that's happening. That it's very entitled, and I think that it's so dangerous to not understand that the purpose of work is to create value for the world. It's to do the Genesis 1 mandate. Like we were called as a team. This is really where I get the whole theology of family teams, is really from Genesis 1, where the families were called to be fruitful and multiply, to subdue and to rule. And so we need to become a productive unit as a family team. And so if you're, if you can experience some small sort of example of that, and begin to understand what it's like to coach your kids to do something of value, to make some money. And to me, the value of getting paid is a demonstration that somebody finds what you're doing really valuable to them, as opposed to something that's icky. No, it's a really great demonstration that what we're doing matters. And obviously there's other signals of that, but that's a great one. And so let's make some money as a family.
Right. So you hit on this a little bit earlier when you were talking about the rhythms, like living a life. You talked about living a life in a series of sevens when you were here at the church. But one of the rhythms that you talked about was really like that 24-hour of really honoring the Sabbath. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I don't think it's talked about enough. I think it's been lost and people are not understanding this. And it was a huge, again, reminder to Shaw and I, but you actually take 24 hours off. Like that's just unheard. It's not unheard of, but it's definitely something that I want people to hear your experience with that. And as a family, right? Littles, teenagers, one of the things you said is you can't force, you never wanted to force your kids into these ideas and those kinds of things. But I'm thinking about my kids on a Friday night and us all being in the home. They're going to want to go. I mean, they're in that stage where you said, they're kind of creating some of that independence. So can you share, first of all, what that looks like for you and your family with that shutdown? You work really hard for those 6 days and then you're kind of shutting things down.
Yeah. Yeah. So we tend to really slam into our Sabbath. So it starts for us on Friday night. And so we like to work a really productive week. And then, come Friday afternoon, we begin to prepare for our Sabbath day. A lot of one of the first things people don't understand is it takes work to rest. You have to have planned and prepared, and made sure that you've thought about like what to do with that 24 hours. For us, it starts on Friday night, like it does in Jerusalem and with Jewish families, because, our first command about the Sabbath is it was evening and morning, the first day, the seventh day. So we start on Friday night with a multi-generational meal. We bless the sons, bless the daughters. I give a little reflection on the Sabbath. We light a candle, we sing a song, and we eat a really good meal and hang out. And no one has anywhere to go. We're enjoying each other. Sometimes we play games. Sometimes we do a little Bible study. Sometimes, we have dessert. We have a dance party. We do a lot of fun stuff. Our kids love inviting their friends over. Our kids, we started doing this when our kids were pretty young. So, and they absolutely do not ever want to miss a Sabbath. It is so fun. And when their friends, come over and get into it, they understand why. It's like most people have just never been immersed in a big multi-generational family meal like that. That's really healthy. And when they find that, it's like, just hanging out with friends, on a Friday night just doesn't, it honestly pales in comparison to that experience. So, but I was describing, when you're starting this with teenagers, I think you got to be really careful because they're not going to have that experience initially. And And so you do want to be gentle and careful about how you introduce this. And you want them to kind of woo them into whatever the experience is that you're creating. But I really want to create a meal that my kids would really want to bring their kids to someday. So that's Friday night. And then Saturday, we have kind of broken up into segments. Like, you really have to think about how to find your off button, how to totally recharge. You have a day to recharge. And so, I've thought about what activities in the morning really do that for me, the early kind of afternoon, the late afternoon, the evening. And so we've just like kind of Lego blocks, tried various things. And, until we figured out, okay, yeah, when we read, we kind of go for a little walk. We do our date night on Saturday night. And so by the time, I go to bed on Saturday night, I'm usually totally recharged, and ready to go. And my burst of creative energy tends to just erupt on Sunday. And so I work about, 5 or 6 hours on Sunday. And I really, then because most people don't work on Sunday, I can just have that time to myself and just really think through the week and what are some things that we want to build. And we also do, some family activities and family work on Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. One of the topics that I talk about a lot here on the podcast is burnout and, women giving themselves permission to take that rest. We kind of live in this hustle culture 24/7, 365 and not giving ourselves permission. And honestly, even in the Christian community, a lot of women are like, but I'm supposed to be doing for others. I'm supposed to be serving all the time. I don't know where the disconnect is between, God says rest,
Right.
And while we feel like we are limitless as individuals and entrepreneurs. So can you speak to all just really briefly on burnout, what you've experienced and what you've seen, and has this really helped you?
Yeah, hugely. If you're never more than 7 days away from a feast and a whole 24 hours of rest, it's really hard to burn out. The only way you could burn out in that kind of scenario is you don't know how to steward that time. Because that's a lot of time. Like,
Yeah.
it's so, but I think you're right. I think what happens is people's sense of obligation, and because there isn't, I think this is where the command to rest, and I don't believe that after Jesus that we have to rest, but I think that this is, God was extremely strict with the Israelites on this topic, because I think it actually freed them up to fully rest. And I think in the gospel, we need to receive that Jesus has finished the work. He did the real hard work that we could never do. And so part of really trusting and resting in the gospel is really trusting and resting for 24 hours, like just enjoying what that could mean, and saying, yeah, this is going to be costly at first. I don't know how this is really going to impact, but I think that one of the things I've discovered too is there's a big difference between, sort of doing a Sabbath that you might do. You're not quite sure. It depends if we have the time and what we have the schedule. And then having a Sabbath that you absolutely know is going to happen. Once your body and soul and spirit fully expect that 24 hours is coming, that's when your productivity becomes really powerful, because you can go flat out and know that I'm not going to burn out because I'm going to have that 24 hours and I know where my off button is and I know I can rest. People don't understand how incredibly costly it is to not know when you're going to get a real break, because you're going to always need to hold back. And I think burnout is sort of technically starting the next week with less energy than you started last week with. So you can just see that trajectory that slowly goes down over time. And after 6 months of that, 2 years of that, you're going to burn out. Yeah. You need to make sure that every single week you're starting fully recharged.
That's so good. So good. So someone's listening to everything that we have said, and they're ready to kind of take a next step here based on what we've discussed. What's a practical, one step they could do to start this journey?
I love that one, honestly. I love when I hear families learn how to have either a family meal, and this is different, by the way, than the kind of weekday, let's catch up, before we all go off into our individual activities kind of family meal. I'm talking about what Thanksgiving meal was really designed to be, but isn't, because we only practice it once a year. And so it's a little bit awkward. Right. So, I think starting a family meal is great. And then learning for that to kick off some real rest, finding out how to fully recharge. That there's something about both experiencing your family identity, in a kind of a timeless moment like that. When you don't feel like you have anything better to do or anything else to rush off to, and then going into that day of rest together, I don't think you'll be able to stop multi-generational family culture from really building from practices like that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time here on the show. And we will definitely put links to Family Teams and what is it? Family Business Inc. What is the business coaching?
Yeah. So if you go to familyteams.com, it's called Family Inc. And that's the name of our coaching app.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we'll include all the links because I know you're going to be wanting some resources, and I definitely believe that they have the best resources for this. So thank you so much, Jeremy, for your time coming on the show. This was awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, Martine.
Well, that's a wrap, friends, for this week's episode of the Mompreneur Life Remixed podcast. Thank you so much for listening and for following the show. It means so much to me. And listen, friend, sharing is caring. So if you loved this episode and thought of some fellow mompreneurs who could benefit, send them the link. Share this episode or take a screenshot and head on over to Instagram and share and tag me at Martine31Williams. We are connected on Instagram, right? It's where you will get all the fun behind the scenes of my life and business as a mompreneur. Until next time, know that I am believing in you always.